50 years ago, on Yom Kippur, 1973, Egypt and Syria, with the support of other Arab nations, launched a surprise attack on Israel, seeking to undo the defeat that they had suffered in the Six-Day War and wanting to overturn the results of the 1948 War of Independence, as well as the United Nations vote in 1947, establishing the State of Israel. They set out to destroy the Jewish state, the only Jewish nation in the world. I recall the sense of vulnerability and horror that we Jews felt in synagogue as the peacefulness of that day was shattered. Early reports from the front lines about the defeats and the setbacks Israel was experiencing made it seem like Israel was hanging on by a thread. It was a dark time, even more ominous than the days leading up to the Six-Day War, when tens of thousands of body bags had been prepared and lined up in the streets of Tel Aviv for anticipated casualties. Miraculously, and I do mean miraculously, the IDF turned things around. In a daring maneuver, Arik Sharon defied orders and led his forces on a surprise attack across the Suez Canal, cutting off Egypt's Second Army. He then proceeded with his troops to encircle Egypt's Third Army, eliminating the threat from the south. In the north, in the battle that came to be known as the Valley of Tears, significantly outnumbered by a force of more than 50,000 troops and 1,200 tanks to Israel's less than 180 tanks, General Avigdor Kahalani rallied the exhausted, depleted Israeli forces, running literally from tank to tank, and shot or moved each one a little bit to make the Syrians think they were facing a formidable force, when in reality, most of the Israeli tanks were inoperable, and there were only a handful of Israeli soldiers with him, but they succeeded in forcing the Syrians to retreat from the Golan Heights. Both of these men and their divisions were recognized as heroes and credited with saving the country. I once mentioned when teaching a class in a Jewish summer camp that Israel's victory in this, as well as the Six-Day War and the War of Independence, were all miracles. In 1948, Israel's population of 700,000, surrounded by 21 Arab nations, bent on its destruction, with no previous military or battlefield experience, and an untested army with limited supplies and ammunition, survived and won that war. Well, after the class, a young Israeli teen came up to me, and he challenged what I had said, as only an Israeli kid would. And he said to me, "My father fought in one of those wars, and he was an atheist. So how can you say it was a miracle?" And I replied, "Because I believe in a God who has a sense of irony and who sometimes uses even those who don't believe in him to achieve miracles." As I mentioned on Rosh Hashanah morning, realizing the precariousness and the tenuous uncertainty of Israel's survival during those frightening days is when I first began to think about my responsibility to do what I could to ensure the survival of Israel and the Jewish people. And when, in retrospect, as I think about it, I subconsciously began to consider the path that ultimately led to my decision to become a rabbi. The notion that the fate of Israel is important to the Jews in the diaspora had already been implanted in me and in my soul. On Friday, June 5th, 1967, on the 5th day of the Six-Day War, my father took me out of school to go with him to a rally at Lafayette Park in front of the White House in support of Israel. Israel's surprise, stunning victory in the Six-Day War awakened a new sense of pride in Jews throughout the world, who no longer felt they needed to hide or obscure their identity. The rally was the first time that I saw outward displays of being Jewish with young Jews singing and proudly wearing kippot, not only while in synagogue, but while they were out in public. What the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War had in common is that Jews in America and throughout the diaspora united and rallied to support our brothers and sisters in Israel. I've heard stories from elders of our community, from philanthropists and leaders who've spoken of times when they or their parents gathered in parlor meetings in people's homes. The doors were locked, and no one was allowed to leave until the necessary funds were raised to help Israel in its time of trouble. Money to purchase the famous ship, the Exodus, was raised in meetings just like these in 1947 in Washington and in Baltimore. These Jews realized the gravity of the threat and were united by a common sense of mission, purpose, and most of all, solidarity with their fellow Jews. Prior to Israel's War of Independence, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, sent Golda Meir to the United States to raise $25 million so they could purchase arms for the anticipated attack of Arab armies once independence was declared. Someone had come earlier and had not been very successful. There was no guarantee that she would be able to succeed. So she went and she spoke to the UJA Federation annual meeting in Chicago in January of 1948. She told them while they were on the front line preparing for the war that would inevitably be waged against them, quote, "The Jewish community in Palestine is going to fight to the very end." And she said, if we have arms to fight with, we will fight with those. And if not, we will fight with stones in our hands. All we ask of Jews the world over, and mainly of the Jews here in the United States, is to give us the possibility to go on with the struggle. Just as we have faith in our youngsters in Palestine, I have faith in you, in the Jews in the United States. Then she concluded her remarks to the packed crowd, who hung on to her every word, and she said, "You cannot decide whether we will fight or not. We will. The Jewish community in Palestine will raise no white flag for the Mufti. That decision has already been made. Nobody can change it. You can only decide one thing, whether we shall be victorious in this fight or whether the Mufti will be victorious. That decision American Jews can make, and it must be made quickly, within hours, within days." She was sending an important message to the American Jewish community. She was saying that we can be apathetic and ignore the appeal to help. We could view this as the problem of people in a faraway, distant land with whom we have no connection, meaning we can sit on the sidelines as observers, or we can stand with our fellow Jews and recognize our shared fate and our common destiny and our obligation to join with them and to be their partners in defending and securing the state of Israel. Our advocacy for the Jewish state, like our efforts to rescue Soviet Jews in the 1970s and 1980s, were guided by that sense of being a family, and most likely also motivated by feelings of guilt over the silence and lack of activism of our parents' generation, who did not speak up and who did not do enough to save the Jews in Europe when they faced persecution, discrimination, and imminent destruction and ultimate annihilation. In each of Israel's major military confrontations, Israel knew they were not alone. It's important. They knew that while they were being attacked and were the ones on the front line, American Jews were united in our support for them, and they could count on us. And so Golda concluded her speech, "I believe that you will realize the peril of our situation and will do what you have to do." She was basically paraphrasing a fundamental principle expressed in the Talmud. Kol Yisrael arevin zeh lazeh. All of Israel has a responsibility to and for each other. Yes, we knew what we had to do, and we did it. And they were not the only ones who knew we stood with them. American politicians of all parties and persuasions knew that the support of American Jewry was united and transcended any political differences on domestic issues. As a result, those holding or seeking office would never dream of taking positions that would be perceived as harmful to Israel. Regrettably, my friends, those days of unity, solidarity, and clarity of purpose are over. We are so divided today. When I was in the UAE earlier this summer with a delegation of rabbis, one of the ministers in the government of the United Arab Emirates admonished us about how distasteful the airing of our dirty laundry in public is. He told us how surprised he was to receive calls from Israelis discouraging him from meeting with his counterparts in the Israeli government. Organizations with the word Jew, Jewish, or just the letter J in their name have no second thoughts about criticizing and opposing positions taken by the democratically elected government of the State of Israel and supporting candidates who proudly proclaim and do not hide their distaste for Israel or opposition to its policies. Now, we're used to Israel's enemies and anti-Semites on the left and the right demonstrating against Israel. At one time, the only Jews who joined in picketing Israeli leaders were the small, fringe, extremist, insignificant, marginalized Hasidim known as Neturei Karta, characters who look like characters out of a Woody Allen movie. But this past week, Jews and Jewish groups, including rabbis and leaders of the Reform and conservative movements, joined protest against Israel's prime minister in front of the United Nations as he was addressing the world body, the United Nations, the place which passes resolutions condemning Israel as often as there's a traffic jam on the Beltway, the parent body of UNRWA, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and UNESCO, which is the international body that minimizes or accepts the Palestinian denial of the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. That is where they demonstrated. Now, some think that public protest by Jews is a positive development, and it represents a maturing of our relationship and signifies a newfound independence and sophistication. I do not. I fail to see how Jews publicly protesting Israel's leader or its policies or government outside of Israel is a healthy development. Israel obviously has its faults and is not perfect. But how can non-Jews see these protests and not conclude that support for Israel among Jews is not as solid and universal as it once was? Whereas at one time, any candidate for public office knew they needed to express support for Israel at public gatherings of Jews if they wanted to gain favor with the Jewish community, that's no longer the case. In fact, at an annual breakfast earlier this year, sponsored by our local JCRC, one of our senators, for the second year in a row, felt comfortable criticizing Israel in a matter that he would never dream of doing were he speaking before any other ethnic group. I'll let you guess which senator that was. Some people say they do not like being pandered to. Personally, I like being pandered to. I like when politicians know that this issue is important to me and they articulate positions that we want to hear and want them to take to earn our vote. I know we cannot turn back the hands of time, and that the halcyon days of unity and universal support for Israel are behind us. They cannot be recaptured, and they most likely will not return. Unless you were on the planet Mars for the last few months, you surely know about the weekly demonstrations protesting the government's proposals to reform the judiciary, along with a myriad of other issues. Those who are leading the protests have issued calls for American Jews to speak out and to weigh in, to join them, and to ask our government to get involved. Some have gone so far as to say that funds should be withheld and call for people not to invest in Israel and for Israeli reservists to refuse to serve or to take actions to show their disapproval of the government's proposals. I fear the dire predictions of pending disaster could become self-fulfilling. And while I recognize the healthiness and the vitality of a country which can engage in and tolerate self-criticism, I also worry about the potential long-term damage the unrelenting protest may do to how people feel about Israel. This self-inflicted harm they are calling for reminds me of the scene in Mel Brooks's movie Blazing Saddles. Do you remember that, where the sheriff is holding a gun to his own head, and then he threatens that if anyone moves, he will have no choice but to shoot the guy who's holding the gun. That's what they're doing. The way the controversy over judicial reform is being reported gives the impression that there's only one side in this debate, and that the position of the demonstrators is the only valid and virtuous one. Since they are portrayed as fighting to preserve democracy, the clear implication of their virtue signaling is that those in favor of the judicial reforms are opposed to democracy, and they implore us to join them. The appeal to weigh in is having an impact, as many rabbis across the country are giving sermons on these high holidays critical of the Israeli current government. Some of my colleagues and leaders of the American Jewish community describe the situation in terms that, if it were true, if you think about it, would be unprecedented. These leaders parrot the opinion of Tom Friedman that Israelis are begging us to join their cause and to swoop in to save Israel itself from catastrophe. But I ask, since when have all Israelis agreed on anything? Since when have they all had the same opinion on anything, especially on a complicated, complex issue? But we're being told they want us to come in. Were this true, it would be a first in Jewish history. It's important to reassure you that the claims that Israel is suddenly no longer democratic, or that it has somehow become a dictatorship and is in danger of not being a democracy, are exaggerated hyperbole, and I'm here to tell you they're just plain not true. The most obvious refutation is the weekly mass demonstrations, which by the very fact that they're taking place negates that claim. Can you imagine public demonstrations like this taking place in authoritarian regimes, which really are dictatorships? Places such as North Korea, Afghanistan, Russia, Syria, or any other Arab country for that matter. And yet, the mantra has been repeated so often, it has taken on a life of its own and air of credibility without anyone questioning whether or not that allegation holds water and is true. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister in the previous government, I think did a fantastic job. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. But it's interesting to note that none of those who currently claim that Israel is not a democracy objected or made those claims when a guy who only got 5% of the vote was chosen to lead the country. So in the spirit of Din v'Cheshbon, introspection of this season, while some may feel there's no alternative to keeping up the pressure, I instead urge that we press the pause button and we consider the long-term ramifications of publicly airing our internal conflicts and differences with each other and publicly expressing dissent here in the diaspora, discontent, disagreements, and disparaging the only nation-state of the Jewish people. The most important thing rabbis and American Jews can do at this time is to avoid virtual signaling, for it only serves to strengthen the extremists on both sides and make it that much more difficult to find common ground and to reach a consensus. We should encourage both sides, or whichever side you agree with, to heed the call of President Herzog to work out a compromise so we can be extricated from the current stalemate. In a column published in the Times of Israel before the holidays, I suggested that when rabbis compose their sermons, they should be guided by two critical fundamental questions. They should consider and should ask themselves, one, will their message promote greater understanding of the unique challenges Israel faces? And two, will their sermon inspire, uplift, and instill a sense of pride in being Jewish and engender a positive feeling and connection to Israel and the Jewish people? I'm pleased to tell you that I received a note from a rabbi who read the column and afterwards said he went back and changed his high holiday sermon. Now, I do not want to give the impression that I am oblivious to the problems with the government's policies and that there are not legitimate reasons to object to some of the proposals. There are. A number of the initial proposals put forth were excessive overreach, and should never have been proposed, and thankfully have been taken off the table. In conversations I had with cabinet ministers and others, I delivered this very message. And I reminded them of the Talmudic saying, tefasta harbe, lo tefasta. You grab too much, you wind up grabbing nothing. And I also am deeply troubled and share the justifiable concern that many of you may have over offensive statements and inexcusable actions of extremist elements and members of the current government. And I hope that their influence will be minimized, that they will be marginalized, and that their terms in office will be short-lived. In my meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu this summer, I expressed directly to him concerns about how they are contributing to the people in his government are contributing to the alienation and polarization in Israeli society, and with the rift with American Jews, while adversely affecting Israel's image in the world. But nevertheless, just as I would not want citizens of foreign countries to interfere and tell us how our country should be run or how our Supreme Court should be reformed, I reject calls for us to lobby the United States government to intervene in the internal debate about what's going on in judicial reform in Israel. Throughout the thousands of years of the diaspora, as we were dispersed across many lands, it usually did not work out too well for us when outside forces intervened or were invited in. So as a result, I do not intend to call for intervention or discuss the specifics of the legislation or advocate what should be done. As you've heard, there are pros and cons on both sides. That's a decision Israelis will have to make, and a problem they need to solve, as only they can heal the internal fissures that have erupted and are dividing their society. So in the spirit of Yom Kippur, when we're supposed to look at ourselves and not someone else, rather than preach what I think Israel should do, I'd prefer to articulate the picture of what I believe we should do and what principles should guide us in regard to Israel. And I suggest we approach the current predicament and what is going on in Israel today the same way we should approach other internal debates going on in Israel about what is the best policy for it to pursue. First and foremost, we should approach it with a sense of humility. Humility because I recognize that even though I keep up to date on what is going on, I'm not aware of all the background, nuance, motivations, implications, personalities of the various issues. And I'm willing to admit that I do not know what I do not know. Some people hear former generals and prime ministers and assume they're speaking from a position of objective authority without being aware of how much of the attacks are driven by subjective personal animosity and attempts to settle decades-old slights and grudges. Additionally, we must recognize that our reality is different, very different than theirs. Most of us have no idea what it means to be surrounded by hostile enemy forces, face terrorists face-to-face, or fight in an army. Most of us have never had to defend ourselves or lose loved ones in a battle or terrorist attack. Not only do we not live with the possibility of not knowing where or when the next attack may come, but we're conditioned to react differently. When there's an attack or an explosion in Israel, Israelis instinctively run toward the scene to help. In America, we're told, see something, say something. In Israel, the motto is, see something, do something. Since living in the comfort of America, we will not have to live with the consequences of the decisions and risks we may favor. I do not believe we know better than them or have the right to tell them what to do. While we can be involved in the internal discussions, we should not dictate anything. But most importantly of all, I have faith in the Israeli people. Based on its track record, I trust its leaders and public to do the right thing. I've seen the creativity of the people of Israel in solving seemingly insurmountable challenges, a nascent, impoverished nation of only 700,000 people. Absorbed refugees who came dazed from concentration camps with nothing but the trauma of what they had experienced. Immigrants from displaced persons camps and 700,000 Jews evicted from Arab lands, all forced to leave their property and everything they owned behind, were absorbed and within a couple of decades become successful, productive members of society, contributing to the country. The galloping triple rate of inflation in the 1970s and 80s led to the joke, do you know how you acquire a small fortune in Israel? Easy. Come with a big fortune. That's no longer the case, as Israel's now an economic powerhouse, known world over for its innovations and earning it the moniker of stand-up nation. We all know that Israel did the impossible and made the dream of the desert bloom, of the early Chalutzim. They made it a reality. A country with a notorious shortfall of rain and with water at a premium, it has led the way in desalinization and is the world leader in recycling and purifying wastewater. So I have faith in Israel, in its people, and its ability to solve tough problems, especially when it pulls together and faces its problems in a united front. With Israel celebrating 75 years of its existence, Most of us do not know of a time when the state of Israel did not exist. We take its existence for granted without thinking about what it is that Israel has provided and given us. The leader of cultural Zionism, Ahad Ha'am, envisioned the Jewish state as being at the fulcrum, with Jewish communities around the world revitalized by it. One example of the cultural renaissance and flourishing of Jewish culture that has occurred because of Israel is the revitalization of the Hebrew language. Israeli music, poetry, literature, and theater often make reference to Jewish themes or allusions to characters, verses, passages, or stories in the Bible or rabbinic literature. A bus in Israel, like it here in America, has seats reserved for the aged in the front. But instead of saying reserved or used just for the elderly, it uses takes words from the Bible which tell us, takum lifnei seva, rise before the elderly. How's that for a guilt trip? I've seen Jewish communities in Eastern Europe and elsewhere revitalized and revived by Hebrew songs, language, culture, and dance. Israel has rescued Jews in sometimes daring clandestine missions from around the world, including active war zones, and on occasions, negotiating a temporary ceasefire and paying bribes in order between warring sides just so they could extricate Jews from the conflict and bring them home safely to their brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. Fellow Jews have been saved and brought out of Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Ethiopia, the countries of the former Soviet Union, and so many other places. Israel has taken in elderly, infirm, unskilled, and uneducated people who were or would have been rejected by any other nation. Most recently, just within the last few months, tens of thousands of homeless refugees from Ethiopia, Ukraine, and Russia have been welcomed and absorbed. Not only have Jews around the world been helped and rescued, but putting Jewish ethics into action, acting on the mandate to do tikkun olam whenever and wherever disaster strikes, as we know, Israel is there to help. Guided by the principles of social justice, Israel has helped underdeveloped nations around the world. This summer, when I was at the foreign ministry in Israel with rabbis from the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, the organization I started of rabbis from all movements committed to Jewish unity, I learned about something called the Mashav program. The Mashav program was started in 1958 by David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, who was then Israel's foreign minister. They act on the prophet Isaiah's call to be a light unto the nations, or lagoyim, and send experts to help throughout Africa and underdeveloped countries to share agricultural expertise and to lead public health programs to underserved areas throughout the world. Israel has not only performed humanitarian acts for others and rescued Jews from persecution, but has also helped to save Jews in America from assimilation. As I mentioned at the outset, Jewish pride was kindled by the Six-Day War and caused Jews in America and around the world to hold their heads a little higher because of it. Jewish camps celebrate Israeli culture. Were it not for Israel's inspiring Jews in the USSR, all those Jews, 1/3 of our people, would have been lost to us. Our knowledge of Judaism and study of Jewish text and connection to the Jewish people is stronger than it would be were it not for Israel. At a time when birth rates around the Western world are declining, Israel is the only industrialized Western country where the birth rate is on the rise, helping to replenish our people after the decimation and annihilation of 1/3 of our people by the Nazis. People in Israel may criticize and raise valid critiques, and we may agree with some of them. That's their prerogative. They'll be the ones who will endure the consequences. So for those of us outside of Israel, our criticism must not be louder than our expressions of love. And I do not love Israel because it is perfect, nor do I need Israel to be perfect for me to love her. So what is our job, especially at a critical time such as this, when we see more divided than ever? First, let's not forget how far Israel has come in 75 years. The 1950s were known as the austerity period, when the state imposed food rations of 1,600 calories per day. The story of a small people scattered across the globe for 2,000 years, returning to its ancestral homeland and surviving against all odds, defeating the very forces who have sought its destruction, where the impossible is never seen as an obstacle, inspires us, should inspire us, as well as other freedom-loving people around the world. Too much is at stake. Now is not the time to allow a wedge to be driven between us, especially when the possibility of the elusive peace with Saudi Arabia is in the offing and can be tasted. And let's not forget, we are family. So we shouldn't really be fighting with each other, but rather should join together as soldiers in the war to fight the public opinion battle against Israel. We should be fighting in the battle to against delegitimizing and demonizing Israel. We should be fighting the smearing of Israel in the United Nations and holding the Palestinians accountable for their anti-Jewish rhetoric and rewarding of terrorism. We should be rallying not against Israel, but against the despicable conference taking place at the University of Pennsylvania and other college campuses to malign Israel and intimidate Jewish students. We should be vigilantly working to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. The Midrash tells us that it wasn't until the people of Israel were united as one, encamped at Mount Sinai, that God gave us the Torah. May we be united. May we heed the call of Golda Meir in 1947 when she challenged us and she said, to realize the peril of our situation and do what you have to do. May the unity we felt then and 50 years ago on Yom Kippur be renewed and restored, and let us do what we can. Yes, we knew what we had to do then, and we did it. May we do it again, and may we join in the age-old prayer for the peace of Jerusalem and the welfare of the Jewish people, and let us say, Amen.
Kol od balevav penima nefesh Yehudi omia ulfate mizra kadima Ein lezion Sophia